One of the most successful films and stage plays of all times is Walt Disney's The Lion King. It first started off as an animated cartoon many decades ago, very popular. It was adapted into an even more popular Broadway play, which is played all over the world, about 4 different times here in Louisville already. The story is rather simple, as most Disney stories are, but it carries some wonderful themes that I think will help us with our liturgy this morning. Basically, the story is Mufasa, who is a great and good king. And of course, since he's a cartoon character, he can be both great and good and show almost no semblance of evil whatsoever. Unlike kings that you and I have read about, heard about, or thought about all through human history, who frequently have a blending of good and bad with maybe more dose of the bad than there is good. But Mufasa really represents all that is good. He's fair-minded, he's regal, he's good to his people, he protects them, and of course he loves his son, a young lion cub named Simba. Simba, of course, seeing his father with all his majesty and all his glory, dreams of the day that he can have that power, that he can become king. He has a young person's misunderstanding of the challenge that comes with kingship. All he can see is the real power of it. And I don't think it enters his mind that for him to become king, his father has to perish before that can happen. Early on in the musical, though, there's a beautiful number on there called I Can't Wait to Be King. And you can see sort of the immaturity in Simba's concept of what a king really means. He sings, "Let every creature go for broke and sing. Let's hear it in the herd and on the wing. It's going to be King Simba's finest fling. Oh, I just can't wait to be king." Of course, as the story unfolds, we know there's an evil character. What's a Disney cartoon without an evil character, right? And the evil character never wins. Remember, this is Walt Disney. But Mustafa's brother, Scar, is, of course, very jealous about the power that Mustafa has, and he's very desiring to wield it, and not in good ways. And so there's a subplot in there where he is going to attempt to cause the death of Mufasa and somehow involve Simba in the process. Without revealing too much of the cartoon, but surely to heavens, everybody has seen it. Mufasa is tricked into falling over the cliff, and Simba's there left on his own. But of course, he's also riddled with guilt because whatever mistake he has made has led to his father's death, and he also escapes out into the wilderness. And suddenly, there is no king other than Scar, which takes over the kingdom. You know, as the show develops, you ultimately see Simba grow up, and you see him acquire maturity with the help of several animals, if you know the story, and then return for the final battle with Scar, and then actually become what his father was, a great and glorious king. And even in that drama, Mufasa, while dead, appears in his memory, in a spiritual form that helps him ultimately realize his mission for good. And I think the parallels to that and the Feast of Christ the King, King of the universe, are strikingly similar. The scriptures this morning, the first one and the third one, are kind of connected together. The first is the story of 2 well-known kings of the Old Testament, Saul and David. Most of this takes place in the first and second books of Samuel. And Saul is a great king who is constantly at war with the Philistines and always in danger of being conquered. He's summoned by the Spirit to select David, the son of Jesse, who will understudy him and help deliver the kingdom to him. Of course, David rather famously battles the giant Goliath and begins to acquire military fame and power, all at the same time respecting Saul, who is the king of Israel. Saul, though, like Scar, is filled with jealousy. He doesn't understand why David gets accolades and praises and why he himself can't be the one that delivers his people, and ultimately becomes so consumed with this jealousy that ultimately tries to kill David, and David is banished, just like Simba was, out into the wilderness. But if you know the story, it doesn't last that long. When they do try to find each other, David first gets the chance to kill Saul and put him out of his misery. But he says, "I will not slay the Lord's anointed one." And from afar, he lets him know that he had spared his life. And then Saul forgives him They don't live happily after. Saul continues to be jealous. Saul continues to hold David at a distance. And in the end, David becomes stronger. Saul becomes weakness. And if you know the story, he gets the death he richly deserves on the battlefield. And then David becomes king. I don't want to leave it there. When David becomes king, this isn't Simba, and this isn't Mustafa, this is David. We'll quickly learn soon enough that he has his own fallen nature, his own sinful pride, and he too will have to experience tragedy and consolation, even if he couldn't wait to be king. Our gospel reading, of course, you know, are familiar with it because when we read the Passion, this story always comes up. The story of Jesus between two criminals is mentioned in all four of the Gospels, but the lengthiest version of it is in Luke's Gospel, which we finished the Gospel of Luke with this week. This is fresh in my mind because we took a group over to Oberammergau, Germany, just right after Labor Day to see the world-famous Passion Play that had been delayed by 2 years because of the pandemic. And the Passion Play is a 5-hour extravaganza, all in German, of the Passion story. And the scene of the crucifixion of our Lord and the criminals next to him takes almost an hour of the production at the very end. And it is absolutely riveting, immersive, powerful, emotional, in every way you can possibly imagine. With that being fresh in my mind, I want to render the story rather quickly, well, as quickly as I'm going to do something, right? Is to render this story to you. Jesus is decreed to be the King of the Jews, but the title is meant to be an insult more than anything else. When I was doing our walk through the Masses last week, which we have recorded and placed on our website, part 1 on Wednesday, part 2 on Thursday, when I was doing our walk through the Mass, one of the questions that came that I hadn't anticipated was, why do we have INRI at the top of our crucifixes? What does it mean? I kind of knew what it meant, but I didn't know how the letters worked. I know it means the King of the Jews, but it doesn't look that way. After researching it, I learned that the Latin, basically translation of this is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Rather famously in the story, Pilate, of course, orders this inscription to be placed on the cross, and the religious leaders come to him complaining. It should say, he said he was King of the Jews. And Pilate, who's got a penchant for understatement, says back to the Jewish leaders, what I have written, I have written. The whole idea that he's King of the Jews leads to mockery, and we know that. The soldiers mock him. They put a purple cape around him, which is supposed to be a sign of royalty, a crown of thorns on his head, and of course the ignominy of the entire march with the cross, and then the brutal death and execution that takes place there. Very powerful scene. So today we pick up an important piece of that. Near the moment of his death, it comes very near the climactic moment of the Passion Play, we know Jesus is hung between two criminals. The crowds are even jeering him. If we can imagine such a thing, it's such a sad, terrible occasion. Only Mary and the few women with her and one apostle, John, hang around for this awful scene. And yet there are the two criminals. The first of the two rebukes Jesus just like everyone else, as if somehow he's in a position of superiority, which he is not. And he says to him, if you're King of the Jews, rescue yourself and rescue us. The other thief, the other criminal, criticizes the first one and actually says of Jesus, we are justly condemned of our crimes. They were apparently both murderers. Jesus had killed no one and therefore is receiving an unjust sentence. And then the most famous part of the story is that the second criminal says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' last words to him, and literally his last words, besides I commend my spirit in Luke, is he says, today you will be with me in paradise. Well, to the observer, those words don't mean much of anything. I mean, today you will be with me in paradise. In a few moments, they'll break the legs of the two criminals. They don't break the legs of Jesus because of the scripture passage that says his bones will not be broken, but a lance is put to his side and blood and water pour out, and Jesus is unquestionably dead, placed in his mother's arms, buried in a tomb that was not his own, with a big stone rolled in front of it. It doesn't seem like today anybody's with anybody in paradise till Easter Sunday comes. And when Easter Sunday comes, the disciples and the loved ones find the stone rolled away. Later, Jesus will appear to them, particularly that evening in the upper room where the Last Supper had taken place. And suddenly they will see our risen Lord and Redeemer, but it's mysterious and it's scary. They don't fully grasp it. At the Last Supper, where Jesus was, of course, what we know, he instituted the Eucharist that we're celebrating here this morning. Prior to that, as he spoke to the apostles, he was telling them that he was going to leave. They never understood him when he gave these prophecies, and they didn't understand him that evening either, that he's going to leave. And he said, if I leave, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I prepare a place for you, I will come and take you there myself, so that where I am, you also may be. Those prophetic words are the ones that lead into the Last Supper and the Eucharist as you and I begin to understand it. And the church began to celebrate the Eucharist. Over time, they would come to understand that it is a ritual richly shared by all of us about the journey to the salvation and the fulfillment of the Lord's promise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. For you and I, the events are 2,100 years ago, and quite frankly, while it's history, we've studied it and learned it, like every other historical event we can think of, we simply were not there. We know about the science fiction of time travel, and as a child loved this series, The Time Tunnel. It was on for 2 seasons in the late 1960s, and they would always land in famous historical events, and you kind of see the depiction of that. But the reality is, all we know is what our history tells us, and with the culture wars that are going on, we're even quibbling over that. What is our real history? What does it really mean? What really happened? And so for even the most ardent Christian, the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is a story that we've been taught and a story that we believe. But we most certainly don't remember it in the classic sense. Or do we? As I was teaching in Walk Through the Mass Part 2, that's where we do the liturgy of the Eucharist, the tradition of the church has been from the very beginning that the act of worship we are celebrating here this morning in time, 10:15 when we began here in Louisville, Kentucky, at this particular address at the corner of Baxter and Hepburn Avenue, there's a clear sense of time and space that anchors this celebration. But surely you know that all around the world, in places near and far, in places we can't even think of or imagine, the Eucharist is being celebrated in the vernacular of the people that are doing. There's probably never a moment when the Eucharist isn't being celebrated somewhere. Multiple different kinds of celebrations. Are they all different? Does Jesus appear in all these different places? How can such a thing happen, we ask? So many people revert to the idea that it's just a ritual, that it's a representation or a reenactment. It's something to stir our imagination and to stir our faith, and we find it spiritual. Well, I'm telling you otherwise, which is that actually in the Eucharist, we are there. We remember the passion and death. As I taught in the Walk Through the Mass, long-standing Catholic tradition, that when the great prayer, Eucharistic prayer is prayed, the prayer of Jesus to his Father, when that prayer is being prayed, we are witnessing the actual, the real, the one and only sacrifice of Jesus. If you insist on the distinction, they used to teach that the one at Calvary was bloody, the one on our altar is unbloody. That's actually inaccurate because we use wine which Jesus says, "This is my blood, which will be poured out for you." Therefore, for Catholics, it's not a representation. It's not a regurgitation of a memory. It's not a story. It's not anything. You are witnessing, and I am witnessing, the event that purchases our salvation. We are there, even though we don't feel like we're there. I'm a priest. I don't feel like I'm there either. We're the same thing. I mean, I'm here at St. Bridget. That's where I'm at. That's where you're at, in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's cold as H-E-double-L outside. And that's what this is. And Thanksgiving is coming. And who's ready for that? That's the world that we sort of live in right now. Yet in this moment, not through magic, but fulfillment of the Lord's promise, we're with him in heaven, even if it doesn't seem that way. And this is the beauty of the Eucharist. When we receive Holy Communion, which is the apex the celebration that unfolds in time. It starts when you all gather. It finishes when we sing our closing hymn. Over a period of time, we're experiencing a miracle that is timeless. It's outside of time. That's why there's only one. That's why there's not copies. No matter how imperfectly it is celebrated, and it always is celebrated imperfectly by the presider, it is still the perfect sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who said, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you there myself, so that where I am, you also may be. The classic interpretation of this, which is lovely, I use it at the funerals, is that when we die, the Lord comes and escorts us and takes us into heaven. Therefore, we don't have to worry about the details. And I still believe that to be sound pastoral theology of death, but more is involved. Every time we experience Eucharist, we also anticipate our own death. We also remember the Lord's death, even though we don't remember it, because we're present at it. And so the only way this sacrament can be available to us is if the Lord prepares it and takes us to himself, so that where he is, we also may be. The power of Eucharist and why we should celebrate it over and over again and again, because only in our crazy mixed up world, only in this sacrament do we have a real basis for hope. Only in this sacrament can we see what the end really is. The sacrament gives us hope. It doesn't alleviate our fears. It doesn't alleviate our suffering. It doesn't solve any of our problems. It doesn't stop politicians from fighting. What on heaven's earth is ever going to stop them from doing that? It doesn't stop any of those things, and yet it reminds us those things are temporary, and that ultimately we will be received in glory. So the wonderful thing about we celebrate is the promise Jesus made to a thief who goes unnamed, hanging on a cross next to him on the worst day in human history, the death of our Lord Jesus Christ. As the criminal says on our behalf, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The Lord replies not only to him, but to each and every one of us in this glorious and mysterious sacrament today, not tomorrow, not in the future, not at a time we do not know. Today, there's no ambiguity there. Today, you will be with him in paradise.